The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Harold Mitchell descended the wooden steps into his root cellar and found water pooling around the potato bins. It was January 1947, and outside the temperature read 12 degrees below zero. But inside this 8-foot-deep chamber, his grandfather had carved into the Michigan hillside, something was terribly wrong. The stone walls were sweating. Harold knelt beside the nearest bin and pulled out a potato. The skin felt warm against his palm, almost feverish. He squeezed gently, and his thumb sank into softening flesh. Harold stood there in the dim light of his kerosene lantern, holding that dying potato, and felt his chest tighten. This cellar had protected his family's crops since 1882. His grandfather had hauled out limestone rocks by hand to build it, had stored potatoes here for 40 winters, without losing more than a handful to rot. Harold had followed every instruction the old man had given him, every single one. But now 800 bushels of potatoes were breathing their last in the darkness, and Harold had no idea why. He climbed back into the winter morning and trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn where his wife Margaret was milking their Jersey cow. "The potatoes are rotting," he said. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the pail stopped. Margaret sat very still for a moment, then turned to look at him. "How bad?" Harold twisted his wool cap in his hands. "Bad enough that I'm scared to look at the rest." Margaret stood slowly, leaving the milk pail sitting in the straw. She was a practical woman who'd grown up on a farm, who'd survived the Depression by stretching everything, wasting nothing. But Harold could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. 800 bushels meant 48,000 pounds of potatoes. That was their breakfast hash all winter. That was supper alongside the salted pork. That was seed potatoes for spring planting worth more than their milk cow. That was 200 bushels they'd planned to sell so their 9-year-old daughter Anna could get her teeth fixed. The dentist wanted $25, and Harold had been counting every potato like coins. "Check them all," Margaret said quietly. "We need to know." Harold spent the afternoon pulling potatoes from every bin in that cellar, and what he found made his hands shake. The rot was spreading through the piles like something alive and hungry. He'd squeeze one potato, and it would collapse in his grip, releasing a smell like death. The one next to it would feel fine, but 2 hours later it too would be soft. He loaded the worst ones into bushel baskets and hauled them to the hog pen, watching his premium seed potatoes disappear into pig bellies. By evening, he'd counted his losses. 480 bushels were gone or going. He had maybe 320 bushels left that looked clean, for now. That night at the kitchen table, Margaret wrote numbers in her ledger while Harold sat with his head in his hands. "We can stretch it if we're careful," she said. But they both knew that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was Harold didn't know what had killed his potatoes, which meant whatever remained in that cellar could die the same way. They could wake up next week with nothing at all. Harold barely slept. At first light, he hitched his horse to the sleigh and drove 6 miles through the snow to find Tom Weatherby. Tom was 73 years old, had been storing root crops since before the Great War, and if there was an answer, Tom would have it. Harold found him in his workshop, sharpening saw blades on a grinding wheel. The old man listened while Harold described everything: the sweating walls, the warm potatoes, the speed of the rot tearing through his bins. Tom set down his saw blade and looked at Harold with an expression somewhere between sympathy and disappointment. "Walk me through your whole setup," he said. Harold described the 8-foot depth, the limestone walls, the wooden bins his father had built. Then he mentioned the 2 ventilation pipes, one at each end of the cellar. "I sealed them in November," Harold added, "stuffed them with rags to keep the cold air out." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said 4 words that hit Harold like a fist to the gut. "That's what killed them." Harold felt his face go hot despite the winter cold. "But the cold air turns the starch to sugar," he protested, "makes them taste sweet, ruins them for cooking." "My grandfather told me—" "Your grandfather never sealed those pipes," Tom interrupted. "Never. Not once in 40 years. The old man stood and walked to his workbench, picked up a piece of paper and a pencil stub. He drew 2 vertical lines. "This is your cellar. Cold air comes in the bottom pipe here, gets warmed by the potatoes, rises out the top pipe here. That's called convection. Keeps everything at 38 to 40 degrees, steady as a heartbeat. Carries away the moisture your potatoes breathe out. Carries away the carbon dioxide. Harold stared at the drawing. Potatoes breathe. Everything alive breathes, Tom said. Your potatoes are 90% water, and they're still living down there in the dark. They're consuming oxygen, releasing heat and moisture and gas. In a sealed room, all that builds up. Temperature rises. Humidity goes to 100%. That's when the bacteria wake up hungry. You didn't create a root cellar, son. You created an incubator. Harold drove home through the snow in silence, his mind replaying every conversation he'd ever had with his grandfather about potato storage. The old man had taught him about curing potatoes after harvest, about removing damaged ones before storage, about the proper depth for a cellar. But Harold couldn't remember him ever saying, "Keep those pipes open." Maybe he had, and Harold forgot. Maybe the old man thought it was so obvious it didn't need saying. Either way, Harold had just learned the most expensive lesson of his farming life. He went straight to the cellar and yanked the rags from both ventilation pipes. Cold air immediately poured in through the bottom. He held his hand over the top pipe and felt warm, stinking air rising out like breath from something sick. The system was working finally. But was it too late? Harold spread his remaining potatoes across the cellar floor, abandoning the bins entirely. One layer deep, with air flowing around each one. Then he began the most tedious task of his life, inspection. 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening, he'd descend those stairs and walk among the potatoes, looking for the slightest sign of softening or discoloration. Each day he found fewer bad ones. Each day the temperature held steadier. Each day felt like a small victory against the rot that had nearly destroyed everything. Margaret suggested they eat potatoes at every meal, reducing what could rot. Fried potatoes with eggs at breakfast, potato soup at lunch, baked potatoes at supper. Their 12-year-old son James complained he was tired of potatoes. Harold told him to be grateful they had potatoes to complain about. The temperature in the cellar stabilized at 40 degrees. The condensation disappeared from the walls. Harold hung a thermometer where he could see it from the stairs, checking it obsessively. Too cold, and the potatoes would convert their starches to sugar, becoming sweet and mushy when cooked. Too warm and they'd sprout or rot. 40 degrees was the magic number where potatoes stayed dormant, sleeping through winter until spring. But Harold's education wasn't finished. Late February brought a warm spell that melted the snow and sent water trickling through the ground into his cellar. He watched the thermometer climb to 47 degrees and felt panic rise in his throat. At 45 degrees, potatoes wake up. They think spring has come. They start pushing out green sprouts, draining their own flesh to fuel new growth. Harold grabbed a shovel and started clearing away the melted snow from around the ventilation pipes. Then he did something that seemed insane. He packed fresh snow against the exposed stone walls of the cellar above ground. The snow acted as insulation, but more than that, it cooled the earth surrounding the chamber. He opened both cellar doors, creating a draft that pulled frigid night air through the space. Within hours, the temperature had dropped back to 42 degrees, but the damage was done. Harold found green sprouts pushing through the skin of potato after potato. The sprouts themselves weren't dangerous, just bitter and tough. But each sprout drained nutrients from the potato, weakening it, making it more vulnerable to rot. Margaret spent the next week sitting by the kitchen stove, twisting sprouts off potatoes until her fingers were raw and stained brown from the juice. In early March, Tom Weatherby came by to check on Harold's progress. The old man walked through the cellar, examining the single-layer spread, the open ventilation pipes, the thermometer on the wall. He nodded approvingly. "You saved most of them. That's better than I thought you would." Then he sat down on an overturned bucket and said, "Now let me show you what your grandfather knew, but never got the chance to teach you." Tom picked up a potato and turned it in his hands. "See how the skin's thick? That didn't happen by accident. After you dig potatoes, you don't just throw them in a cellar. You let them sit in the field for 2 weeks. Any cuts from your digging fork, any bruises from rough handling, the potato heals those over. Grows thick skin. Your grandfather used to spread his harvest on the barn floor every October, leave them there while he finished other work. Seemed like laziness to some folks, but he was curing them. 65 degrees, good air circulation, time to heal. Rush that step and you're storing wounded potatoes that'll rot before Christmas. Harold remembered his grandfather doing exactly that, spreading potatoes on the barn floor. He'd thought it was just convenient storage while the cellar was being prepared. He'd never understood it was part of the process. Tom set the potato down and picked up another. And you can't just take hot potatoes from a warm field and throw them into a cold cellar. Your grandfather would move them in stages, from the barn floor to the cellar entrance for a few days, then halfway down the stairs for a few more days, then finally to the bottom. Slow cooling, 1 or 2 degrees at a time. Cool them too fast and you shock the cells. The potato thinks it's freezing to death, starts converting starch to sugar as antifreeze. That's why cold shocked potatoes taste sweet and cook into mush. Harold watched Tom handle the potatoes with a reverence he'd never quite understood before. These weren't just food, they were living things that needed to be understood, respected, guided through their seasonal sleep. And here's something most folks don't know, Tom continued. Never store potatoes with apples. I learned that the hard way, 1923. Had a good apple year, stored them in the same cellar as my potatoes. By February, every potato had sprouted like it thought it was May. Apples give off some kind of gas that wakes potatoes up. Same with onions. Everything needs its own space. They sat in that cool darkness for another hour, while Tom shared what 3 generations of farming had taught him. How to read the color of a potato skin to know if it was cured properly. How to tell by smell if rot was bacterial or fungal. How to position storage containers so air could flow around them. How to know when a sprouted potato could still be planted and when it was too far gone. These weren't tips or tricks. This was knowledge earned through cold winters and hungry springs, through mistakes that cost families their survival, through the accumulated wisdom of men and women who'd learned to work with nature instead of against it. By late March, Harold had rebuilt his entire storage system based on what Tom had taught him. He constructed wooden racks that stood 8 inches off the floor, stretched chicken wire across the frames, and created platforms where air could flow beneath and around each potato. He made peace with his losses. He'd saved 240 bushels. 40 of those became seed potatoes for spring planting. The rest would feed his family through the lean months. In late April, Harold cut his seed potatoes into chunks, making sure each piece had at least 2 good eyes. Those eyes were the sleeping buds that would become new plants. He spread the cut pieces on his racks to warm slightly, encouraging the eyes to wake up and start pushing out shoots. Then he planted them in neat rows, covering each chunk with 4 inches of soil. The date in his farm journal read April 26, 1947. Below it he wrote, "Ventilation pipes stay open. Always. Cure before storing. Cool slowly. Keep watch." That growing season gave Harold everything he needed. Rain came when it should. The days were warm, the nights cool. He hilled his potato plants twice, pulling soil up around the stems to encourage more tubers to form underground. When Colorado potato beetles appeared, he sprayed a mixture of water and soap that his grandfather had used. By mid-July, the plants were yellowing, the signal that the potatoes beneath had reached full size. Harold waited 2 more weeks to let the skins set firm, then began digging. From 40 bushels of seed potatoes, he pulled out 6,000 pounds of new crop. It wasn't enough to replace what he'd lost, but combined with what remained from last year, he had food and seed. More importantly, he had knowledge. In late August, when the night temperatures began dropping, Harold followed the process Tom had taught him. He spread his harvest on the barn floor for 2 weeks, letting the potatoes cure in the warm, dry air. Then he moved them to the cellar entrance for 3 days, then halfway down the stairs for 3 more days, then finally to his slatted racks at the bottom. Slow cooling, gradual adjustment, working with the potatoes instead of forcing them. That year's winter was brutal. January temperatures hit 20 below zero, but Harold's potatoes stayed perfect at 39 degrees. The ventilation system pulled cold air in, warmed it with potato heat and pushed it out, maintaining that steady temperature without ice crystals or condensation. Harold checked his thermometer every morning and every evening, watched the air flow through those pipes his grandfather had installed 65 years earlier, and understood for the first time what the old man had built. Not just a hole in the ground, but a living system that breathed and regulated itself if you let it work the way it was designed to. By spring, Harold had lost less than 2% of his crop. He had food for his family, seed for planting, and surplus to sell. Anna got her dental work and Harold had money left over. Years passed, and Harold never forgot that winter, when his ignorance nearly cost his family everything. When his son James was old enough to understand, Harold took him down into the root cellar and taught him everything Tom Weatherby had taught him. Not as a list of rules to memorize, but as a story about potatoes that breathe and sleep, about systems that work when you understand them, about the difference between knowing how to do something and understanding why it works. James learned to read the thickness of potato skin, to smell the difference between healthy earthiness and the first hint of rot, to feel the subtle warmth that meant trouble was coming. He learned that farming wasn't about dominating nature, but about paying attention to it, working with it, respecting the life in things. Harold's grandfather had known all this without thinking about it, the way a man knows how to breathe. He'd built that root cellar with ventilation pipes because his own father had taught him to, and his father before that, knowledge flowing down through generations like water through good soil. That cellar itself told a story about how Americans had learned to survive winters in a land that could be brutally unforgiving. Harold's grandfather had based his design on techniques his family brought from Germany, but he'd adapted them to Michigan clay and limestone. Other farmers made different adaptations, depending on where they lived and what materials they had. Harold remembered visiting his wife's cousin in Vermont, seeing their root cellar accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, built right into the foundation of the house so you could harvest potatoes without stepping into a blizzard. He'd heard about farmers in Missouri who built above-ground potato houses with double walls filled with sawdust because the ground there didn't freeze deep enough to provide natural cooling. Different solutions to the same problem: how to keep potatoes alive through winter so your family survived until spring. The techniques changed based on climate and geography, but the understanding stayed the same. Potatoes were living things that needed specific conditions to stay dormant. Temperature between 38 and 40 degrees, humidity around 95%, air circulation to carry away the carbon dioxide and moisture they exhaled, darkness to prevent greening. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were observations about how potatoes actually lived, translated into practical action by farmers who paid attention and learned from their mistakes. Harold had made his mistake by assuming knowledge was the same as understanding. He'd known about ventilation pipes, he'd seen them his whole life, but he hadn't understood what they did or why they mattered. He'd thought he could improve on his grandfather's design by sealing out the cold, when actually he'd destroyed the system's ability to function. That winter taught him that sometimes the old ways worked, not because they were old, but because they were right. The wisdom wasn't in blindly following tradition. The wisdom was in understanding why the tradition existed in the first place. The root cellar Harold's grandfather dug served the family until 1972, when James installed electric refrigeration in the barn. The new cold storage unit maintained precise temperature and humidity automatically, without anyone checking thermometers or clearing snow from ventilation pipes. It was efficient and reliable and easier. But James kept the old cellar functional anyway, cleaning it each spring, checking those ventilation pipes each fall. He understood that electricity could fail, that equipment could break, that sometimes the old ways worked when the new ways didn't. And he understood something else too. That cellar represented more than just a place to store potatoes. It represented his great-grandfather's labor, his grandfather's education, his father's hard-won wisdom. It represented generations of knowledge about survival, about paying attention, about respecting the life in things. Every potato stored in that cellar was a connection to farmers who'd come before, who'd learned these lessons the same hard way Harold had, who'd passed their knowledge down so their children wouldn't have to make the same mistakes. Harold lived to see his grandson take over the farm in 1983. The boy used the electric cold storage and never touched the old root cellar except to show it to school groups studying agricultural history. But Harold noticed that his grandson paid attention to details, asked questions about why things worked the way they did, treated his crops with respect instead of just as commodities. The specific techniques had changed, but the fundamental understanding had survived. Farming was about working with living systems, not against them. That understanding mattered more than any individual technique or tool. It was what separated good farmers from failed ones, what allowed families to survive when others didn't, what turned a hole in the ground into a system that could preserve life through the deadest part of winter. Harold's mistake in 1947 had taught him that lesson in the most painful way possible. But it had also given him something valuable, the knowledge that he didn't know everything, the humility to ask for help, and the wisdom to understand that every potato in his cellar was alive and breathing, and depending on him to do right by it. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about how American farmers stored their potatoes through brutal winters, using knowledge passed down through generations, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about agricultural heritage and traditional farming wisdom. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone interested in how our ancestors survived using practical knowledge and community support. This video is inspired by real historical events and agricultural practices documented throughout rural America during the 1930s through 1970s. It does not aim to represent or offend any specific individuals. Harold Mitchell is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar storage challenges during this era, learning through trial and error to preserve their crops and their livelihoods through long, unforgiving winters.